he's not talking about Israel as a nation that some might claim. He's talking about a person. He's talking about an individual. Who's this individual that your own scriptures talk about? And the reason why I say that you probably never read it, because it's not read on the circuit of what you go through in the synagogue. Why do they skip it? Think about that. Why would they skip this portion? Read it and find out.
Can you tell our listeners where you grew up and what kind of Jewish home did you grow up in?
I was born in New York City. I grew up just outside of New York City, in the suburbs just outside, about a 20-minute drive down into the city. My home was quite secular. We rarely talked about God. In fact, I only remember one conversation about God, and it didn't last very long, between my sister and my father. I was in synagogue probably twice a year, something like that. So other than being circumcised on the 8th day, that was about it for me.
Okay, so did you have a sense of your Jewish identity growing up, or?
Absolutely. I absolutely had a sense of my Jewish identity. If somebody had asked me, I would say I was Jewish. My cousins were more practicing than I was. None of us were Orthodox, but certainly they practiced more diligently than we did. We got together for the Passover. And so if anybody had ever asked me, I was Jewish.
Yeah, sure. Not only that, you were growing up in what they call the Second Holy Land, right? New York.
Absolutely. I mean, in my elementary school, I would say it was 98% Jewish, other than the blacks that were being bused in, because when I went to first grade, that was the first year of busing in New York City, and so they were being bused in from the projects. But so as far as I knew, you were Jewish or you were black.
Okay, interesting. So at some point in your life, you heard about the gospel. And how did that happen? And what was it like coming to faith in Yeshua, Jesus, as a Jewish man?
Well, I had never really met a Christian that said that they were born again Christian until I went to college. I worked in a gas station on the Hudson River Parkway, that just outside New York City. It was on the Parkway, and it going south and north, worked both sides. And occasionally Christians would hand me tracts, and I would read them on the night shift. And a couple of them really struck me. They were tracts by a man named Chick tracts. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but they're okay. Well, yeah, they're kind of outdated now, but they're really quite vivid and you know, the sinner generally ends up in hell in these tracts.
I've seen those before, yes.
Yes. And so I used to read those and read it several times because we had a lot of extra time, especially on the night shift. But when I went to college, a young man shared with me in the laundry room in August of my freshman year. And we got to talking in the laundry room, and it was clear to him that I was not a believer. And I asked him what he wanted to do when he graduated. He said he wanted to be a missionary. And I thought, why would you want to do that? I didn't even know missionaries existed today. I thought they'd all been killed off. And he asked me if he could give me a presentation of the gospel. And he was with the Navigators Campus Ministry. And he gave me the presentation. And that was in August of my freshman year, end of August. And in November of my freshman year, I was all alone in my room, and I bowed my knee, and I asked Jesus into my life. But what really struck me in his presentation of the gospel to me is when he said, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And I remember reading that from the Bible, and he opened the Bible, and I said, "I'm not a sinner." And he was a bit taken back by that. And as you understand modern secular Judaism, and I understand that now, why I would have said something like that, because in modern secular Judaism, it's not a thought that makes you a sinner. You got to do something bad. You got to rob a bank. And I remember I said, I never robbed a bank. I never killed anybody. How could I be a sinner? And then he turned to Matthew 5:28, "For I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And I was immediately convicted because I was addicted to pornography from the age of 14. Working in that gas station, I had found magazines, and my first job was to clean the parking lots and the restrooms. And I found stashes of magazines, lots of them. And so I was addicted by the age of 18, and this really hit me. But what's amazing about this is, why should I even care? Why should I care what some guy says 2,000 years ago? And some guy named Jesus. I mean, for all I know, Jesus is a Christian, I think. And why should I even care? But the words really struck me. And I remember looking at him, that something I do in my heart can make me a sinner, which is totally unlike secular Judaism. We're not guilty for what we do in our hearts. Certainly within Orthodox Judaism, it's different. I'm talking about secular. And so so he certainly had my attention at that point, and he took me through the bridge illustration of the gospel. But on November 7th, 1977, when I bowed my knee to the Lord, I asked him to forgive me, and I felt this burden of sin just start lifting from me. It was really quite profound. And then all of a sudden, it was as if a man was standing right next to me. And I looked to my right, and I couldn't see anything clearly of a man, but the presence was so overwhelmingly strong. I just turned toward him and fell on my face to the ground. I was already on my knees and just weeping. And I wasn't scared. It was just an amazing sense of love, just overwhelmed by love like I never knew. And I didn't want to get up from there. And he wasn't going anywhere. The presence was so strong. And then the next thing that I remember, I don't know how long I was there. I was standing up, wiping my face, and because I had just been weeping, and something happened to me at that moment, on that day. And this burden of sin that I had been carrying since August lifted from me. And I didn't tell anybody. And 2 weeks later, this guy who'd shared with me saw me walking on the floor there in the college, in the dormitory, because he lived on the same floor. He says, "Jim, if you received Jesus in your heart." I said, "I think I have. Why do you ask?" He said, "You haven't stopped smiling for weeks." That's when I changed.
Wow, that's an incredible story, and very encouraging. So here you are, a young Jewish guy. You come to believe in Jesus, who, as we both know, really is the one thing you're not supposed to believe in as a Jewish person, some would say. In fact, some people suggest that believing in Jesus and being Jewish should never and can never coexist. So how do you feel about that claim? Have you encountered that before? And
Yeah, I've encountered that before. That's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, where did they get this? Where did they get this? All of a sudden, out of thin air, they pull this thing. They pull this comment. So people say all sorts of things. Some people say the earth is flat. It just, people say all sorts of things. It doesn't bother me what people say. But, and at the time, I didn't even, so my home was so secular, I didn't even know that I should not believe in Jesus. And so most Jews are trained against Jesus. I was a clean slate. I never listened to what the rabbis had to say. To me, they looked like strange men. I just messed around in the synagogue. I had no respect for this sort of thing, and it's not something I'm proud of. I'm just telling you that there's the fact of it. And I had no training. I was not trained against Jesus. So it was amazing how open I was to his claims and the things that he was saying, because I had never been trained against him. And it really shows you the effect upon Jewish people that they're trained against Jesus. I share the gospel all the time, Levi. I share it with people every week. If I go a week without seeing somebody come to the Lord on a one-on-one sharing, I feel it's been a wasted week. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to share with someone from China that comes from a communist-type background, who hasn't been trained against Jesus, than sharing with a Jew, someone who's been trained against Jesus. It's devastating training that they're undergoing in this. And there's not much in the traditional Jewish writings about Jesus. What is written is not very kind. And he had to be crucified. He had to be killed. on this high Sabbath because of the degree of his divination, something like that. But there's not much written. But what's written is not kind. But then over the generations, it's just been they have nothing good to say about the man, and you can see it in trying to share with people. So when the slate is clean, I mean the testimony of the gospel is profound, and it changes hearts and lives really quite rapidly. That people come around from not believing in the resurrection to believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ with me in a 34 or 40-minute conversation all the time. And these are highly educated people, Americans, internationals, all the time. But Jews, it's a different thing. And so you see the effect of that training. But as for me, if some rabbi says that the two are orthogonal and can't coexist, it means absolutely nothing to me what that rabbi's claims are.
Sure. Yeah. And the very idea, the very premise that one's ethnicity can change depending on a belief is, of course, quite absurd to begin with. It's as if
absolutely.
whether you're biologically male or female, it makes no difference.
Right. And that they can say a person can be atheist and still be a Jew. But if you believe in Jesus, you're not a Jew. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've mentioned several times sharing with your colleagues, sharing at work and so forth. Let's talk about your work briefly. You've been named, Dr. Tour, one of the most influential or one of the top 50 scientists in the world today. Can you explain for our listeners what you do in the sciences?
Well, I'm trained as an organic chemist, a synthetic organic chemist. I work across many areas from biological and medical to material science and just hardcore materials for aircraft, for aerospace, and just the gamut. I take inspiration from a man named Bezalel in Exodus 31. He was the man that Moses hired to build the tabernacle. And God says, I've called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God, and I have given him wisdom and insight and knowledge in all kinds of craftsmanship. And so I say, Lord, give me wisdom and knowledge in all kinds of craftsmanship. So I work across many different areas, and I've started 10 companies, several of them materials companies, 3 of them pharmaceutical companies. And so it runs the gamut. We work across, and we work in electronics. We build molecular electronic systems, work in devices. So I'm uninhibited by these things. And I believe that God answers prayer. When you pray these things happen. And I look at Bezalel. This was a man, it says he could work in gold, in silver, and in bronze. He could work in stone cutting and in stone setting. He could work in wood, in fabric, and perfuming, and he had the ability to teach it. And so and you ask God, and he does it. And in fact, Bezalel was the first man in the Bible, the first man to ever say that he was filled with the Spirit of God. And this guy was a craftsman. And so that's what we do. We work across all these different areas, and we publish papers in these areas, and I love what I do. I just absolutely love it.
That's wonderful. Well, as you're quite well aware, there's a lot of people who put God and science at completely different ends of the same pole, and they say these two things are completely different. You can't both be a believer in science and a believer in God. You can't be both, so choose. You're either religious or you're a scientist. However, obviously, here you are, a professional scientist. What is it that you've discovered about the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, through your exploration of all the different sciences?
Okay, through my exploration of the sciences, is that clearly the God of Israel is utterly amazing. I mean, the creator of the universe, to make this universe, and I look at living systems, I look at biological systems, and you go, whoa, this is so complex. I mean, even a cell is a factory. It is so complex. Nobody's ever made a cell. If people say they've made synthetic cells, they have not. You're wrong, they have not. What they do is they take a cell that already exists, and they might take a genome out of another cell and put it into that first cell, or they might knock out certain genes in the cell, but they haven't made the cell. So nobody knows how to even make a cell, which is the most basic unit of life. And you look at this thing, and it's extraordinary. I mean, to think, I looked at my children when they were growing up, and I was like, how'd you do this, Lord? This is so amazing. I don't know how to make chemicals come together to do this. So when I look at this, it just screams out that there's a God. And but this is, I certainly don't say this in my classroom in this way. I just say that we're clueless on the origin of life. I mean, that's all I can say in my secular classroom. But because that's all you can say as a scientist. You can't, as a scientist, say, I don't know how this happened, therefore God. I mean, some pastors say that all the time. I can't say that as a scientist. Very careful about what I say. And one day we might well understand how life formed from inorganic and small organic molecules. But that day is far away from today, but we just don't know how that happened. So I think it's just life, which is on this planet, absolutely ubiquitous, everywhere. You just turn over a rock and it is teeming with life. And it's not just the things you see, there's a lot there you don't see with your naked eye. But you see, this is extraordinary. You just look at a tree and you think of the photosynthesis process, and most people don't see this. I see this instantly. I see that green leaf, and I know that there's a magnesium atom sitting in the middle of a porphyrin, and there's this funnel that funnels photons from the sun into that. It hits the magnesium atom, and it ejects electrons. Once it ejects electrons, these then travel this long distance down this chute of hundreds of angstroms that start a photosynthesis process that will take carbon dioxide and start breaking it down to make carbon available to the cells in that tree to build that tree. I mean, this is amazing. We don't know how to do that. And so everything I see in a biological system, I'm amazed by this. And so that's what in science, to me, points to God. But again, it's not like you look at DNA and it says the God of Israel was here. It doesn't say that. So as it's been put, that these things are a sign that point us to God. They don't necessarily name God, but they certainly point me to God.
Yeah, absolutely. Here you are. You're a Jewish believer in Jesus. You're a scientist. You're clearly a well-educated, influential man. There are probably some unbelievers listening to this podcast right now. We have folks that listen to the Tov podcast from around the globe, some of whom are certainly Jewish seekers, some of whom just stumbled across this podcast. What would you say to those Jewish men and women who are curious about the claims of the Bible?
Well, I would invite you to read Isaiah 52, verse 13 through all of Isaiah 53. And you might say, oh, well, I've read all that before. I'll bet you haven't. I'll bet you haven't. So why don't you just open your Bible and find out? See who's right, me or you. Isaiah 52:13, read it to the end of that chapter, and then all of Isaiah 53. Just read that. And then think about, who is this describing? Who might this be describing? And think about that. And why don't you ask God? God lives, and he's a God who answers prayer, and say, Lord, teach me. Who is this writer writing about? Lord, teach me. And let him instruct you. If you think that he's talking about the nation of Israel, have you seen the nation of Israel not cry out? I mean, there's things there that say that he's not talking about Israel as a nation, that some might claim. He's talking about a person. He's talking about an individual. Who's this individual that your own scriptures talk about? And the reason why I say that you probably never read it, because it's not read on the circuit of what you go through in the synagogue. Why do they skip it? Think about that. Why would they skip this portion? Read it and find out. It's in your scriptures.
Well, that's certainly a great challenge, Dr. Tour. And there you have it, audience. Dr. James Tour, a very influential scientist, speaking, saying, hey, crack open your Bible and give the Bible a chance. Give God a chance. Yes, our hearts are not inclined toward him. Our hearts are inclined toward other things. But open up your Bible and read Isaiah 52:12 all the way through chapter 53 and just allow the Holy Spirit to work. If it's not true, hey, you'll see that. But if it is true, allow the Holy Spirit to work and show you the truth. I'm wondering if you could tell us about something that I really don't have any clue about, and that is nanobots and the future.
Okay, well, different people have different views of what nanobots really are, but we work on molecular-sized machines, which are about 1 to 3 nanometers in size. We first started making these nanocars that are about 2 nanometers by 3 nanometers, where we could park about 50,000 of them, 50,000, across the diameter of a human hair. So they're really quite small. You can't see them, but we can see them under microscopes, and we know their entire structure just by the chemical signatures that they present to us using a technique called spectroscopy. And but we drove those across different surfaces, and then we built little motors and put them in the nanocars. And now what we do is we just take the motors and we will use them to drill into cells to kill biological cells. Why would we want to kill a biological cell? Well, what if it's a cancer cell or a bacterium or a fungus, and we wanted to kill it? So that's what we do, and we go ahead and do these sorts of things to try to move these along in medicine. So for us, they're working quite well. We have several projects going in cancer, antibacteria. We're coming out with paper on to fungicides to kill fungi, and so this is what we're using them for. People worry sometimes that these are going to get away from us and be uncontrolled. But what happens is for us, the way we build these, it allows us to really kill things that antibiotics aren't killing anymore, for example. And there's 10 million people a year slated to be killed by bacteria, and by the year 2050. So I tell students, when you're my age, it's going to make COVID look like a walk in the park unless we learn how to kill bacteria. So that's what we're learning how to do, and really quite well. And so this is a mechanical action. It drills into the cells. The cells cannot build. They don't build mechanisms against this because it's not a chemical mechanism. Just like you can cut things out with a scalpel, it just drills right into them. It's a mechanical effect. And so what we do is we use these sorts of effects, so we really try to go beyond what's been done before. Now, these can't get away with us because we, first of all, they're designed to go to a specific cell type, but then also they have to be activated by a very intense light source. It's not something that you'll get from under the sun. It's not something you get by walking under typical lamps. And so they can't turn on anyway. And without these intense light sources, they don't activate. So in this way, they're safer than normal pharmaceuticals. And then within a few hours, they're cleared from the body anyway, just by normal mechanisms, chemical mechanisms.
That's fascinating. So we have little nanobots, which are like very small cars with engines, and your goal is to drive these into a bad cell so that the cell can essentially be killed. So is this being used today in the field of medicine, or is it still just kind of in theory and in trials?
Okay, so let me correct you a little bit. So we started by making nanocars. But then what we did is we just took the motor from the nanocars we were making. So we no longer have the wheels and the axles and the chassis. And so it's just the motor that spins like a drill, and it drills into cells. And now we have newer versions that we're designing, like molecular jackhammers, like jackhammers that break on in. But in any case, these are used today on animals, on rodents that we use in the lab. So that it's gone from cells in a dish to lab animals. That's where it is now. And the hope is that we get this translated in the next few years to go into clinical trials. So we are at the stage of applying for what's called an IND, an investigational new drug, to begin to move these into the clinic. We've shown them to be non-toxic, and so that was the first steps, and now we can begin to get these presented to the FDA in this way.
Okay, interesting. So are you seeing results in animals then that you'd like to see?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In animals, it's working great. It's working great. I mean, we are knocking out tumors amazingly. We're knocking out cancer, and then we have other models where we use it on other organisms where we're knocking it out on we're destroying the bacteria. We work on burn models because people who have undergone burns, they have a lot of bacterial infections that form on the skin that can be really hard to knock out. And we're looking at burn models on organisms to show that this is working in vivo in a living organism. So yes, it's absolutely working.
Did you invent these little engines yourself, or was that a team, or was these things been around for a long time?
Okay, so there's little motors called Feringa motors, which have been known. They were invented by a man named Ben Feringa, and he received the Nobel Prize, I think, in 2016 for these motors that spin. Our first generation motors were based on his designs, and then we modified his design. So it was a modified Feringa motor to allow it to interact with a cell. So we had to modify the structure so that it would interface well with a cell. And we modified it so that it would, instead of being excited with UV light, which were the original designs, we moved it toward the visible region. And now we've come up with a totally new design that is more like a molecular jackhammer that's activated through near infrared light rather than visible light. And what this allows us to do, it allows us to have much deeper penetration through human flesh. So we can penetrate about 10 centimeters deep. That's important because now with a 10 centimeter deep penetration, we can use a light outside the body and just about hit any other part of the body because of the depth of penetration.
Wow, that is fascinating stuff, and certainly a matter for our prayers. That, if these types of mechanisms can be successful in eliminating things like cancer, I mean, praise the Lord that He's allowed us to come to this kind of technology.
Yes, cancer is pretty insidious, and so nobody wants to use the word cure because everybody who's used the word cure has been wrong. So we hopefully we'll be able to really knock it down and set these things back. A totally new mechanism of doing it using mechanical action at the nanoscale.
Okay, fascinating. Well, we certainly hope that's successful. Let's transition just a bit here. You work in an academic field. You're at Rice University. You have to teach, and you already mentioned in segment one that sometimes you have to be careful about what you're saying. As you know, our schools, our universities, there are plenty of documentaries out there. Our museums here in the United States declare that life arose by chance, without God's involvement. What are the problems you see with that theory? And as well as, I don't know if this would be the same theory or a little bit closer, as well as Darwinian evolution.
Well, let's take the first one first, the origin of life. Just like people can't say that it arose by chance, I can't say that it arose because of God as a scientist. There's nothing there. There's nothing there in science that says God made life. I know pastors love to say that. Lots of people want me to say that. I'm not going to say it because I can't prove it as a scientist any more than any scientist can prove that you can take inorganic and organic small compounds and create life. So the burden of proof is on these scientists that talk about the origin of life, that say that it's figured out, and it's very easy to defuse them. I just start asking a few questions and everything starts to wither around the edges. Nobody has ever made the 4 basic components that are needed for life in a prebiotically relevant manner, meaning using chemistry that would be available on an early Earth. because you have to make these compounds in a homochiral form. They have to have one-handedness, one mirror image and not the other. And so you have these four classes of compounds. You have the lipids, you have the nucleic acids, which are RNA and DNA, you have the sugars, and which are carbohydrates, and you have the peptides, which are proteins, which come from amino acids. So nobody's ever made cleanly the four classes of chemicals and then polymerizing them together. Nobody's ever polymerized them together either. So the three of the four classes have to be made into polymers. Lipids don't, but the other three classes do. Nobody's ever done that. Nobody knows the code, the arrangement of them coming together, how that would be. But even if you gave a scientist all of the chemicals, all in polymerized form, and with whatever code they want, could they assemble them into a living cell? And the answer is no. Nobody in their right mind as a scientist would claim that they could do that. And then even if you gave them a cell that just died, because certainly a resurrection of a cell should be easier than a de novo synthesis of a cell. If the thing just died, could you bring it back to life? And the answer is no, because we don't even know how to define what it is we just lost when we went from life to no life. That's how clueless we are on the origin of life. And people say, well, we're very close to figuring out this out. We are not, because every year the target moves further away from us as we learn more about the cell. Something about chiral-induced spin selectivity, where you have to have almost complete homochirality throughout the system in order for the cell not to burn up. So it's not like chirality could have come as a second thought on an evolutionary process. It had to be there before life could have begun. Nobody understands the interactomes, where you have just protein-protein interactions in a single yeast cell has 10 to the 79 billion combinations of how these things can be arranged, and only a few of them are going to work. And it's through these non-covalent interactions that you get the information transfer and stuff. Nobody knows how to solve this thing. That's called the Leventhal paradox 2.0. And so there are these things that have just come up in the last few years that make the target of a cell much more complex. So the people who understand what I'm talking about, that work in the origin of life area, don't like to discuss this with me because it's very easy to diffuse their arguments. So we have no idea where life came from. Now getting to your second question, Darwinian evolution. And in fact, this idea of Darwinian evolution, of slow, gradual change, is actually not present in the fossil record. What you see in the fossil record is very short periods of very intense change occurring. This punctuated equilibrium, it's called. So this whole idea of gradualism is essentially non-existent. And this is not just Jim Tour saying this. This is Gould was saying this in 1972. And so then also it's not so much natural selection as it is neutral drift. Neutral drift are the small changes from parent to offspring, their offspring to their offspring, and so forth. And these are these small changes, and this theory of universal common descent. So even the definition of Darwinian evolution has changed to go to a non-Darwinian type explanation. But even with that, you can see small changes. You see small changes all the time. We can see it in our own lab working with organisms. But you never see gross body plan changes. You never see one system changing into another. You never see a visual system changing into an auditory system. And they'll present to you the immune system. The immune system modifies based on what's presented to it, but it never changes from being an immune system. It doesn't change into a digestive system. You never see system level changes. You never see gross anatomical changes like body plan changes. And because these things take many, many changes occurring at the same place in the same time. So it's very hard to understand these things. People would say, well, we're 98% the same, 99.9% the same as a great ape. Well, if you look at 1.5% of the DNA, that is the case. But if you look at the other 98.5% of the DNA, which formerly was called junk DNA, but it's no longer called that, is now called intergenic DNA, there you see gross changes between human beings and the apes. Many changes that have regulatory function. So the mystery is in what was formerly called junk DNA that people ignored. Well, you have 98.5% of the genome was previously ignored. And when you don't ignore that, then you start seeing these total differences. And this has been exposed through a big project called Project ENCODE, which is not a Christian thing. This is funded by the US government, Project ENCODE, to find out what are these regulatory functions? What is the function of what was formerly called junk DNA?
That is fascinating. I'm just guessing that being in your field, you publish a lot of papers, you speak to a lot of people, you get invited to a lot of events. Are you looked at differently in the scientific community? And if so, how does that play out?
Yes, I think I am looked at differently in the scientific community. And when people start talking about origin of life, they change the way they speak when I enter the room. They become a lot more careful about what they say when I'm in the room because I challenge them on it. And they realize that they can't just wiggle through these things because I'm going to persist. I'm going to ask for the explanation. And so when you come with some silly argument, I'm going to call you out on it. And that just happened recently in a meeting. And so people then speak very differently when I'm around. But do people say things behind my back? I'm sure they do because people tell me, oh, these people were saying such and such. But look, I take great consolation in the fact that they talked about Jesus and they said things about Jesus. And so that doesn't bother me at all. And in fact, the greatest discoveries that have come by bucking up against the status quo, especially the opposing consensus. The nonconformist has done this, and especially when you look at what the consensus has, the consensus is on very flimsy ground here, very flimsy. And that's why just a few questions and everybody wants to become silent on this.
Fascinating. Well, that reminds me of one of my favorite books that teaches people how to share their faith, and it's called Questioning Evangelism. It's written by a believer, actually a Jewish believer, named Randy Newman. And his whole premise is just to simply ask people questions about what they believe. And instead of just declaring to them a truth, ask questions that erode the shaky or the quicksand that they're standing on. And I love the book, Questioning Evangelism. And it sounds like that's a method you employ. Even in this discussion about, creation and science, because ultimately we can ask people questions that erode the faulty ground that they're standing on, even when it comes to the origin of life or some other stance that doesn't include God. Are you familiar with Randy Newman's book, Dr. Tour?
No, I'm not familiar with the book, but that's actually a common strategy within the realm of science, that you challenge just based on asking questions. That's a technique that's been around a long time.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's certainly effective in, I guess, the majority of realms. Another question about science here before we conclude. How close are scientists to creating life in the lab? Because, and I think you referenced this earlier, sometimes we're led to believe that it's really close to happening.
Well, certainly origin of life researchers say it's very close to happening. Some have even made claims that in the next 3 to 5 years they'll have it. It's interesting, those claims were made in 2011 by a Harvard researcher, Jack Szostak, made those claims in 2014 maybe. He said in 3 to 5 years. So we've blown past that. We're nowhere close, absolutely nowhere close, and the target gets further away because every year we learn more about the cell that makes it more complex. And so we're further away from figuring this thing out. And I don't know how close we are, but it's nowhere soon. Nowhere soon. It's way beyond my lifetime and way beyond the lifetime of my students. And I am as bold to claim right to their faces, to the Origin of Life community, that you will die of old age before you ever figure this thing out, and your students will die of old age before they ever figure this thing out. So that's how unclose we are.
Gotcha. Well, that's not very close. to wrap up our conversation, and I want to thank you again for spending the time with us here on the Tove podcast. I really think our listeners will benefit from not only hearing your testimony in segment 1, but just also hearing that, listen, when we stand on the Bible's claim that God created everything, we're standing on really solid ground. Because as you're mentioning, the further we dive into the origin of life, the further away the truth seems to be, the further away that we are from a discovery of what started all this. And to me, that just points to an intelligent designer, which is exactly what the Bible proclaims. And so I think listeners will be...
Can I just say one thing to the folks out there, that if you want to hear why I believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, that he died, was buried, and rose from the dead, if you want to hear why I believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, and you are not a believer, so this is not an invitation to people who already believe in that, but if you don't believe in the physical resurrection and you want to hear why I believe, I encourage you to reach out to me and I will respond. And usually within the next couple of days of your sending me that email, we'll be meeting by Zoom. I do this all the time with people. You write to me at tour@drjamestour.org. Tour, T-O-U-R, at drjamestour.org. And send me that email that you're requesting the meeting, that you don't believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ and you'd like to hear why I believe. And we'll have that meeting. And again, this is not for believers, but for unbelievers. And I love to do it, so it's not like you're bothering me. And we get together, and let me tell you why.
Well, that is a very generous offer of you, Dr. Tour. We certainly appreciate your offer to meet with those folks. And I'd encourage the listeners out there, if you're seeing this on YouTube or you're listening on Spotify or somewhere else, hey, why not? Why not take Dr. Tour up on his invitation to have a chat about why he has come to the conclusion that Jesus really has been raised from the grave, which is really the cornerstone of our faith, the belief that in his resurrection. Why not take that chance? Why not take that opportunity? Clearly, Dr. Tour is not somebody who just believes anything he hears. Clearly, he is a rational man. He knows science, and clearly, that can go together with a belief in Jesus. Well, Dr. Tour, I want to thank you again for appearing today on the Tove podcast. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you're enjoying this series, give us a thumbs up and click the subscribe button, and that way you'll hear when we're coming out with new videos. There are no salaried employees in this organization. All the accounting, all the legal work, that's all done by friends of mine. The only thing that I have to pay for is the production work, and if you could help us out with that, I'd appreciate it. There's a link below where you can just click on that and help us in several different ways. Thank you.